When firefighter Nick inherits his grandma's cottage, he thinks he's coming home. But the HOA next door has other plans, and they've already sold his house behind his back. What follows is suburban war. Nick Randall wasn't the sentimental type, at least that's what he used to say. But ever since his grandmother Elsie passed away, he'd found himself driving out to her old cottage every weekend, caught between grief and obligation. The property had been in the family for decades, a quaint 1950s one-story nestled on the edge of a picturesque suburb. It wasn't big, not by today's standards, just 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, and the smell of time-worn wood. But it had soul. Elsie had lived there alone for years, always refusing to join the local homeowners association, even as the HOA's reach crept closer and closer, like vines trying to strangle a wildflower. Now the house belonged to Nick. At 36, Nick was a firefighter, a city man by schedule, but a small-town soul by blood. He still lived in his downtown apartment, finishing up his final month in the firehouse rotation before he could fully relocate. But every Saturday morning, like clockwork, he'd load up his old truck and drive out to the cottage with a thermos of coffee and a quiet promise to get things ready. He wasn't rushing the move. In truth, there was comfort in the ritual. He swept leaves off the porch, polished rusted knobs, cleared out closets that hadn't been opened since before smartphones were a thing. He replaced locks, fixed the crooked mailbox shaped like a moose, and fed a bold little fox that had grown used to Elsie's shortbread cookies. Every corner of the house echoed with memories, the smell of lavender oil, the ticking of Elsie's ceramic kitchen clock, the creak of the 3rd stair despite the house having no 2nd floor. But something else lingered too. Just beyond the tree line, perfectly aligned hedges and nearly identical rooftops marked the beginning of Heather Ridge Estates, a master-planned suburb managed by one of the strictest HOAs in the county. Nick knew the stories. He'd heard about the lawn-length citations and battles over mailbox colors. Elsie used to call them the lawn police, and insisted that her little patch of independence would never be absorbed. Technically, she had been right. Her lot had always sat just outside the HOA's jurisdiction. But standing on the porch with a screwdriver in hand, Nick often caught the wary glances from across the property line, neighbors walking dogs on invisible leashes, their gazes full of judgment or curiosity. He couldn't tell. Still, none of that mattered. The house was his now, a piece of family legacy, untouched by suburban conformity. He was ready to make it a home again. What he didn't know was that, while he was preparing to move in, someone else was already preparing to move him out. It was supposed to be another peaceful Saturday. Nick turned onto the gravel driveway with the familiar crunch beneath his tires and a lukewarm gas station coffee in hand. He was humming faintly to the tune on the radio, thinking about finally refinishing the bookshelf in the living room. But as he rounded the last bend and caught sight of the house, the hum died on his lips. Something was very wrong. There was a white utility van parked squarely in the yard, its hazard lights blinking like a warning. Next to it, a team of men in construction gear moved with purpose, one hauling off what was left of the front steps, another tearing down the shutters with a crowbar. A third stood on a ladder, detaching the vintage wind chimes Elsie had hung years ago. The sound of a circular saw screeched through the air. Nick slammed on the brakes so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim. He leapt out of the truck, heart pounding. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" A man in a neon vest turned casually, barely acknowledging the fury in Nick's voice. "Remodel," he said simply. "Owner wants the porch redone, shutters gone, whole facade modernized. It's in the contract." "What owner?" Nick barked. "I'm the owner." The man squinted, pulled out a clipboard, and flipped through papers. "You Nick Randall?" "Yes." Well, this says the owner sold the place 3 weeks ago to the Evergreen Development Group. I've got work orders signed off, remodeling for new buyers. Nick yanked the clipboard from his hands and scanned the documents. There it was, a bill of sale, a contract for structural renovations, all stapled neatly. And on the seller's line, a signature labeled Elsie Randall via authorized HOA representative. His stomach turned to ice. "Elsie's dead," he growled. "She's been dead for 6 months. I'm her legal heir. I never signed anything. This is fraud." The contractor shrugged, already dialing his foreman. "Not my fight, man. We just do what the paperwork tells us." Nick stormed up the porch, what was left of it, fighting the sick realization that someone had sold his inheritance behind his back. He called the police. The responding officers arrived within minutes, exchanged glances as Nick presented his inheritance documents and the workers showed their signed contracts. One officer flipped through the HOA documents and frowned. "Well, sir, this is a civil dispute," the younger cop said carefully. "We can't determine ownership right here. You'll need to take this to court." Nick could barely process it. The porch was splintered, the wind chimes were gone, and his name, his blood, his right had been erased on paper by people who didn't even belong to this land. As the workers packed up, awaiting further instruction, Nick stood alone in the yard, eyes burning. What kind of monster forged a dead woman's signature? He was going to find out. Nick didn't sleep that night. He sat in the gutted living room of his grandmother's cottage, surrounded by boxes he hadn't even finished unpacking. The scent of sawdust still hung in the air, mixed with the distant echo of hammers from the earlier intrusion. His grandmother's house had become a construction site without his consent, and someone was going to answer for it. At 9 a.m. sharp the next morning, Nick walked into the Heather Ridge Estates HOA office with a folder under one arm and fire in his eyes. The office itself looked more like a dentist's waiting room, sterile, overly beige, and aggressively floral. Behind the reception desk sat a woman with a rigid smile and too much blush. And next to her, sipping a green smoothie like she'd already won, was Karen Madison, president of the HOA, gatekeeper of suburban conformity. Nick had heard her name whispered with equal parts fear and irritation by the neighbors across the boundary line. Now he saw her in all her glory, perfectly pressed blouse, a pearl necklace that probably came with an instruction manual, and a clipboard that seemed surgically attached to her hand. Karen greeted him with the kind of smile reserved for unruly children. "Ah, Mr. Randall, we've been expecting you." Nick's jaw clenched. "You sold my house." Karen didn't flinch. "We didn't sell your house. We facilitated a necessary community improvement. The cottage had become an eyesore. We acted in accordance with the neighborhood's best interests." "It's not in your neighborhood." She waved off the distinction. "Geographically debatable, functionally integrated." Nick stepped forward, holding up a stamped deed, inheritance papers, even the county property line map. "This is mine. I'm the legal owner. You had no right." Karen's tone shifted slightly. Still pleasant, but with an edge that could cut glass. "Your grandmother made a verbal agreement. She understood the community's vision. After her passing, it was clear she didn't intend for the house to remain unmanaged. I simply followed through." Nick blinked. "She's been dead 6 months. You forged a sale using her name." Karen's lips twitched, as though she found his outrage quaint. "Mr. Randall, please understand. You may feel left out, but these things happen. You can try to fight it, of course. But the buyers have already invested heavily. You'll be going up against families, lawyers, real estate professionals, and us." She smiled again, wider this time. "You're late to the party?" The arrogance in her voice was like gasoline to his fire. Nick left without another word, driving straight to the nearest real estate attorney's office. Within 24 hours, he had legal counsel, a plan, and a fireproof folder full of evidence. But Karen wasn't finished. Over the next week, the HOA began what Nick could only describe as a psychological siege. He received a stack of violation notices for ridiculous infractions. Unauthorized wind chime frequency, non-compliant mailbox curvature, untrimmed nostalgic vegetation. All nonsense. Trash began appearing mysteriously on his lawn. Empty HOA newsletters, passive-aggressive notes clipped to plastic forks stabbed into the grass. A pink flyer was taped to his front door. Community harmony reminder, eyesores reflect on all of us. One morning, he caught a man in cargo shorts photographing his porch through binoculars. When confronted, the man mumbled something about visual records for architectural compliance and scurried away like a suburban raccoon. Nick, however, wasn't rattled. He installed motion sensor cameras, upgraded the locks, put in a smart security system with backup cloud storage. He even mounted a new sign on the front gate. Private property, you touch it, you buy it, including lawsuits. Then came the letter. A formal eviction notice, signed by Karen and the so-called new owners, a cheery couple who turned out to be Karen's niece and her husband. They had purchased the home in good faith, had already drawn up renovation plans, and demanded cooperative relocation from the current occupant. Nick read it, laughed, and then stapled it to a piece of plywood next to his new Ring camera with a handwritten addition. Spoiler alert, not leaving. War had been declared, and Nick had just started sharpening his axe. If Nick thought the HOA's antics had reached peak ridiculousness, the coming days proved him catastrophically wrong. It began with the trash. Not random litter, but suspiciously uniform trash. HOA newsletters crumpled and scattered across his lawn in even spacing, as if delivered by a very passive-aggressive paperboy. The next day, he found a meticulously folded stack of old magazines on his porch with a note clipped to the top. Vintage clutter devalues adjacent properties. He tossed them into the bin. The bin, it turned out, wasn't HOA approved either. A new notice appeared on his mailbox. Violation number 042, use of unregistered refuse container, color not in community palette. The attached photo showed Nick's standard black bin circled in red marker with the word non-compliant scrawled beneath like it was evidence in a mob trial. Then came the fines. Each morning, Nick found a new envelope slid under the front door. Inside, a glossy letterhead from Heather Ridge Estates and a new notice of noncompliance. Offenses ranged from the absurd, wildlife-friendly overgrowth, a bush with a bird nest, to the Kafkaesque, excessive window nostalgia because he'd kept his grandmother's lace curtains. One particularly creative citation accused him of potentially offensive lawn expressionism. That one came after Nick mowed the word nope into his front yard using his electric trimmer. Every attempt to contact the HOA office was met with stone-faced indifference or voicemail loops that led nowhere. At one point, an HOA rep answered the phone only to put him immediately on hold, during which an elevator version of Eye of the Tiger played for 17 minutes. But the true turning point came when he spotted a man wearing an HOA badge planting a small "for sale" sign at the edge of his driveway. Nick burst out the front door, phone camera recording, voice sharp. "Take one more step, and I swear I'll print this footage on t-shirts." The man, nervous and clearly underpaid, muttered something about administrative oversight, picked up the sign, and jogged away. In retaliation, Nick responded in kind. He erected a large banner across the porch rail, hand-painted in bold black letters. Not for sale, not part of your creepy cul-de-sac cult. He added a life-size cardboard cutout of himself in full firefighter gear with a dry erase board that read, "Today's HOA violation. Count. Too many." It didn't stop them. Someone began slipping anonymous printouts into his mailbox, grainy screenshots of bylaws, circled with highlighter, often accompanied by sticky notes that read things like, "Just trying to help," or "Your porch light is too warm-toned." HOA patrols increased. Neighbors began walking their dogs suspiciously close to his property line. One woman jogged in place for 10 straight minutes in front of his house while pretending to tie her shoe twice. Nick even caught a drone hovering just above the back fence. He waved at it. It bumped into a tree and crashed, which he enjoyed far more than he admitted. The final straw came when Nick received a glossy, printed catalog in the mail titled Community Integration Kits. Inside were suggested remodels for optimal conformity, including a sample swatch of Heather Ridge beige, identical to concrete, replacement shrubbery options, and a referral to an HOA-approved life coach. On the last page was a mock-up of his own house, digitally altered to match HOA standards. He held up the catalog in front of his Ring camera and slowly lit it on fire with a butane torch. "You want a war? You got one," he muttered, watching it curl into ash. That night, his security cameras caught someone creeping up to the edge of his yard and leaving behind a plastic yard flamingo with sunglasses and a note taped to its wing. "Karen is watching." Nick didn't laugh. He howled. He laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch steps. Then he called his attorney. "Tell Sandra we're not just suing anymore," he said, between laughs. "We're about to make HOA history." The siege of paperwork, passive aggression, and beige tyranny had officially gone too far. Now it was time to hit back. With everything. Sandra Martinez had the demeanor of someone who'd eaten 5 HOAs for breakfast and still had room for dessert. She was sharp, stylish, and deadly calm in a crisis. When Nick first walked into her office with a binder labeled Karen Crimes, Volume 1, she gave him a look of mild amusement. By the end of their meeting, that look had transformed into focused intensity. "This is bigger than suburban nonsense," she muttered, flipping through the fake bill of sale. "This is organized fraud." Within days, Sandra's team dug deep. They began pulling transaction logs, witness testimonies, and digital signatures, and that's when the rotten threads began to unravel. First came the so-called power of attorney document, allegedly signed by Elsie Randall and granting Karen Madison authority to sell the property on her behalf in the event of extended travel or incapacitation. The problem? The signature on the form was dated 2 months after Elsie had passed away. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Well, either she signed from the afterlife or someone got real creative with a pen. A forensic handwriting analyst compared the signature to official government records. The verdict was swift, 100% forged. Then came the realtor records. Evergreen Development Group had processed the sale under the belief that Karen was acting as a legal guardian. When contacted by Sandra, the listing agent, visibly shaken, admitted Karen had provided verbal assurances and displayed documents that looked completely official. The agent even offered an apology. "I feel like I sold a haunted house." The buyers, Karen's niece and her suspiciously silent husband, had already invested money into redesign plans. Floor samples, mood boards, a Pinterest page called Modern Cottage Revival, Our Cozy Oasis. Sandra found it all, but the real bombshell came when they uncovered a pattern. This wasn't Karen's first unofficial acquisition. 3 years ago, a house on the opposite edge of Heather Ridge, also technically outside the HOA boundary, had undergone a similar fate. The elderly owner mysteriously transferred rights through a now-deceased notary public. The home was flipped and welcomed into the HOA soon after. No lawsuit had been filed. The previous owner had relocated to Florida and never looked back. Sandra leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen. She's not just power-tripping. She's orchestrating a full-blown land grab, with fake documents, complicit agents, and HOA authority as cover. Nick felt his jaw tighten. How many homes? 4. Yours makes 5, and you're the first one to fight back. He glanced down at the printed copies of emails, voice recordings, and transaction logs, all evidence, all damning. I don't just want the house back, he said. I want every single one of them held accountable. Karen, the buyers, the realtor, the whole smug HOA board. Sandra grinned. Good, because we're filing 3 lawsuits this week. Fraud, civil conspiracy, and negligent misrepresentation. The legal paperwork went out the next morning, and the reaction from the HOA was immediate. Karen launched a PR offensive. She distributed glossy community bulletins, warning residents about Nick's hostile behavior and potential criminal record. One flyer included a photoshopped image of Nick wearing a leather jacket and holding a flamethrower, captioned, "This man wants to destroy our neighborhood's values." Nick framed it and hung it in the hallway. Sandra, meanwhile, subpoenaed the HOA's board communications, and that's when the tone shifted. Emails showed multiple board members had been aware of Karen's tactics. Some questioned her ethics. Others, disturbingly, encouraged them. One read, "If we can get that corner property cleaned up and HOA ready, values will spike. I say Karen gets it done." There was no more ambiguity. This was a scheme. And Nick, he was done playing defense. He filed an injunction to stop any further development or structural changes to the cottage. Then he filed a restraining order against Karen, citing surveillance, harassment, and attempted fraudulent transfer of property. The judge signed it. 2 days later, Karen received the order while hosting a neighborhood vision board workshop on her patio. According to witnesses, her face turned 3 shades of eggplant. Nick watched it all unfold from his porch with a glass of iced tea and his dog, Ranger, at his side. A fresh, "No trespassing" sign gleamed under the sun. "Guess it's renovation time," he muttered. Only this time, the only thing getting remodeled was the HOA's grip on the neighborhood. The courtroom was packed. Locals, press, even a few HOA members with poorly disguised curiosity filled the gallery benches. The case of Randall versus Heather Ridge Estates et al. Had grown from a neighborhood dispute into a suburban sensation. The front row was occupied by 2 lifestyle bloggers live tweeting every moment with hashtags like #Chove's Hero and #Karen's Last Stand. Nick sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Sandra Martinez, who wore a tailored suit and an expression sharp enough to draw blood. Across the aisle sat Karen Madison, flanked by a visibly sweaty lawyer and her niece, whose modern cottage dream was quickly collapsing into a legal nightmare. Karen, still smug behind her pearl earrings and lavender blazer, clutched a binder labeled Property Protocols, Volume 2. The judge, a stern but fair former Marine named Judge Rourke, took the bench and immediately scanned the room like a man assessing a battlefield. "Let's begin," he said, voice like gravel and thunder. Sandra opened with fire. She presented the timeline, the documents, and the digital trail of forged forms and misrepresented authority. She played voicemail recordings of Karen referencing her verbal agreement with a deceased woman. She submitted forensic evidence proving the power of attorney was fabricated, signed posthumously. But the turning point came when Sandra summoned the handwriting expert. The specialist, a petite woman with a massive stack of evidence, pointed to side-by-side samples and declared, "Unless Ms. Randall had a personality transplant and learned to write with her non-dominant hand after death, this signature is fraudulent." A collective gasp swept the courtroom. Karen's lawyer buried his face in his hands. Karen, ever defiant, insisted on testifying in her own defense. It did not go well. "I was preserving community aesthetics," she declared proudly. "The house was in decline. The neighborhood needed unity. The property was not yours," Sandra barked from the plaintiff's table. The judge held up a hand. "Ms. Madison, do you have any legally binding documentation that grants you the authority to act on behalf of the deceased owner?" Karen paused. "Well, no, but there was context. She often spoke with me at bake sales." The courtroom erupted into laughter. Even Judge Rourke cracked the ghost of a smile before restoring order. Nick's testimony followed, calm, composed, direct. He described the shock of discovering strangers dismantling his family home, the months of harassment, the absurd violation notices, and the night someone left a plastic flamingo on his porch with the words, "Karen is watching." "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "this wasn't just a property dispute. It was a targeted campaign. They tried to erase me from my own home." When Sandra rested their case, Judge Rourke leaned back, steepled his fingers, and addressed the defense. Karen's lawyer, to his credit, tried. He stumbled through procedural defenses, cited irrelevant HOA bylaws, and even claimed that a strong sense of community often leads to overzealous acts of beautification. "Beautification through fraud?" the judge replied flatly. Silence. It took the jury only 2 hours to return a verdict in favor of Nick Randall. The courtroom erupted. Sandra offered Nick a high five that turned into a full handshake when she remembered cameras were watching. Judge Rourke, as a sentencing, was swift and uncompromising. Karen Madison was ordered to pay $325,000 in damages and serve 5 years in state prison for fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying legal documents. Her niece and husband were required to vacate all claims, return any money paid, and pay restitution for attempted unlawful occupancy. The realtor involved was fined and had their license suspended indefinitely. The Heatheridge HOA was placed under court supervision for restructuring, with its current board disbanded by judicial order. Karen, pale and shaking, was escorted out of the courtroom in cuffs. As she passed Nick, she muttered, "This isn't over." Nick didn't even turn his head. "It is for you," he said quietly. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Nick, what will you do now that the house is yours again?" He looked into the camera, smiled, and said, "I'm going to mow Victory into the lawn. HOA approved font, of course." Laughter followed. But behind the grin was relief, pride, and the heavy silence of justice finally served. 1 month later, the cottage no longer looked like a battlefield. The porch had been rebuilt, by choice this time, using local cedar and a little elbow grease from a few unexpectedly helpful neighbors. The shutters were back in place, freshly painted in a shade Nick dubbed post-HOA blue. Even the mailbox had a makeover. The moose now wore aviator sunglasses. On a warm Saturday evening, the scent of grilled corn and barbecue drifted across the yard as people gathered for what the neighborhood jokingly dubbed the decaroning celebration. There were folding chairs on the lawn, fairy lights strung between trees, kids chasing bubbles, and someone blasting Springsteen from a Bluetooth speaker. Nick stood on the porch, holding a wooden plaque. The crowd quieted as he walked to the front post and, with a power drill in hand, mounted it right above the steps. The plaque read, "No, Karen, you don't run this house, but thanks for the new porch." Applause erupted. Someone popped a confetti cannon. A neighbor brought over a tray of cupcakes labeled legally owned. Nick took one, bit into it, and muttered through frosting, "Tastes like property rights." A nearby kid pointed at the sky. "Fireworks." Nick looked up just as a fountain of red, white, and blue lit the night, courtesy of the new HOA board, who insisted on ending the evening with a symbolic purge of oppressive governance. Sandra arrived late, wearing jeans and a hoodie that read, "Lawyered." She handed Nick a bottle of local craft cider and nodded toward the new security sign by the gate, which now read, "Protected by the Constitution and several cameras." "Nice touch," she said. "Figured it was less confrontational than try me," Nick replied. As the final fireworks bloomed overhead, Nick sat on the porch step with Ranger curled beside him. The lights shimmered off the new plaque like a full stop at the end of a long, ridiculous sentence. And for the first time in months, the house felt quiet. Whole. His.